I think Putin is trying to basically make the issue a Ukrainian problem. He's trying to convey, we're happy to talk, it's those Ukrainians.
Должен сказать, что ситуация меняется кардинально. Вы это хорошо знаете, я это просто хочу подтвердить. Движение идет по всей линии фронта, каждый день. И, как я уже говорил, речь идет не о продвижении не на 100, там 200, 300 метров. Наши бойцы возвращают территорию квадратными километрами. Хочу подчеркнуть, каждый день, потому что для этого есть все основания. Действовать героически. Боевые действия сложные вещи, поэтому загадывать вперед трудно и ни к чему. Но происходит именно так. И мы движемся, как вы сказали, к решению наших первостепенных задач, которые мы обозначили в начале специальной военной операции.
Мы с ними работали несколько недель на передовых позициях, снимали репортажи.
Я сейчас не могу, не хочу просто называть вот конкретную дату, когда выбьют. Ребята воюют. Вот прямо сейчас идет бой.
President Putin has been given his annual press conference. He said victory is nearer in the Ukraine war, and he pledged to meet Bashar al-Assad, the ousted Syrian leader who fled to Russia a fortnight ago. To help us make sense of what he had to say, let's speak to Professor Mark Galeotti, historian, Russia expert, and fellow of the Royal United Services Institute. Mark, thanks for joining me. Can you explain the concept of this slightly extraordinary and unique press event? Because the Kremlin aren't really noted for their transparency.
Well, no, and in some ways, precisely as a response to that, through the Putin era, he has historically done two sort of mammoth public events. One is end-of-year press conference, and the other one is something called Direct Line, in which ordinary Russians could send in questions, which, of course, were therefore then heavily screened and so forth. Last couple of years, he has actually combined them together into one sort of mammoth town hall event. And look, it's still running now. It's 3 and a bit hours into it. It's probably got another hour yet to run. We never know for certain how long. I mean, if nothing else, one has to say it's an impressive act of stamina. And look, in part, this is in some ways almost a sort of surrogate democratic process. That this is that one sense where people feel that they can actually, reach out to the Tsar. And although a lot of this is very much him delivering sort of boilerplate stuff about how everything's going fine, there will always be these cases where you get sort of a video appeal from a couple in Krasnodar saying we can't get a family mortgage or whatever. And Putin can then look stern and say, oh, something must be done, and he'll look into it. So it gives that opportunity for people to feel that they can actually get through to the monarch and maybe get something sorted.
So he takes phone calls from citizens, but presumably they're very carefully handpicked by the Kremlin before anyone gets through to Putin.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just to make sure that, as it were, the questions are right, but also to ensure that he has an answer.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the characteristics of these things is always that Putin reels off all these facts and figures. I mean, already this time we've had, the level of Soviet wheat imports in 1986 or 4, I forget which, that kind of detail. Now, it's not that he actually remembers this. He's almost certainly got some kind of little earbud feeding him the stuff. But it's all intended precisely, carefully choreographed to give the impression of the caring, but also on top of all the details, chief executive officer of the country.
On Ukraine, what did he have to say on Ukraine, and what do you think was the subtext?
I mean, this is quite interesting, actually, in that he very much pushed the idea that, look, he has no preconditions to talks, which is flatly at odds with what has been said in the past, but let's move over that. And indeed that he's willing to compromise, and that he would be willing to sign some kind of peace deal, I mean, clearly, on the terms that he finds agreeable. But he could only sign a deal with a legitimate Ukrainian figure. And he pushes this idea that because, as a result of martial law, elections in Ukraine have been postponed indefinitely, Zelensky is not that figure. So he's basically saying either Zelensky has to hold elections and win those elections, or that Putin would be willing to sign a deal with the Speaker of the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament. So, I mean, this is at once an act of mischief trying to suggest that, well, all the Ukrainians have to do is jump through some hoops, and who knows, maybe we can have some kind of a deal. But it's also an attempt, I think, to reassure Russians, because it's quite interesting that there was a lot of talk about, when's there going to be victory? And he dodged that one. He just simply said Russian soldiers are heroes fighting for their motherland and such like. And about the, cost of reconstruction, the rehabilitation of veterans. There is clearly concern in the country. And so I think Putin is trying to basically make the issue a Ukrainian problem. He's trying to convey, we're happy to talk, it's those Ukrainians.
He was also asked about Russia's new ballistic missile, wasn't he? And he said, let's conduct this duel and look at the outcome. How do you think we should interpret that?
I mean, this is classic Putin sort of tongue-in-cheek swagger. More or less saying, I'll tell you what, if people think that our new Oreshnik intermediate range ballistic missile can be shot down, you pick a location in Kiev, you can throw in, whatever air defenses the West can provide, and we'll still hit it. This is not something to be taken seriously. He knows precisely that this event, I mean, look, apart from mugs like me, how many people are really going to be sort of carefully in the West, carefully watching all this multi-hour spectacular? He needs to throw in sort of Easter eggs that precisely the media will pick up. So it's a way of just simply, just touting Russia's presumed military strengths, and B, just keeping everyone watching.
What did you make, Mark, of his overall tone and demeanour from this multi-hour spectacle that's still going on?
Yeah, I mean, look, in some ways, this has become such a ritual. We pretty much know what's going to be said. We pretty much know how he's going to say it. There'll be those attempts where he essentially tries to kind of assert himself by telling people to sit down and so forth. Other times where he would try to use some very heavy-handed humor. I mean, look, I think this is a relatively polished performance, because as I say, he's done this many times before. And I have to say, it would be fascinating to see how Western politicians would cope with being bombarded with questions, however carefully screened, for 4 hours. But broadly speaking, I got the sense that this was a man who's essentially trying to say everything is fine. The economy, oh no, everything's fine. Food prices are up, but that's just because Russians are eating more meat and drinking more milk and so forth. The war, I can't give you a precise date, but yeah, absolutely. Russian soldiers, the heroes that they are continuing to advance. This was very much clearly someone who's trying to reassure an unsettled, shall we say, population and elite that everything was fine. So he clearly understands that things are not going fine. Otherwise, he wouldn't feel the need to keep returning to that basic point.
Oh, absolutely fascinating stuff. My thanks to Professor Mark Galeotti for the latest from Russia.